what does Greater Minnesota need out of a discussion around EMS issues at the legislature. Erik Simonson has been leading this effort for us. We're incredibly lucky to have him and his other life experience to help with this issue. He was an assistant fire chief in Duluth. Were you the interim chief for a while? And the interim chief. He's been a licensed EMT since a long time ago. I'll let him give you the date. So we're very fortunate that in-house we had that perspective, that expertise, those connections through Erik. And so I think this is going to be a very interesting discussion. Obviously, there's going to be a lot more that happens here in the next 6 to 8 months, but this will start to frame up where, from a CGMC perspective, we're looking. So with that, I will turn it over to Erik Simonson.
Thanks, Bradley. Good morning, everybody. And I think, Bradley was kind enough not to tell you the date when it all started, and maybe I won't go there either. But I think, from my perspective, wading into this issue has been a little bit, it's different for me. I mean, I really thought I had closed the chapter on all of this stuff a number of years ago. But getting back into it has been good. I will tell you that some of the things that we're going to talk about today have been going on for literally decades in terms of developing this problem and getting it to where we are today. So really see. I'm with you. We're good now. The question is this a new problem, right? And I think, as Bradley kind of alluded to in the beginning, we started to hear some feedback about some bills, or one particular bill that was in this last session. And as we dug into that and talked to more and more of our member cities and folks within those cities, we found out that not only is this not a new problem, this is something that has been looked at so many times over the last number of years, it's almost ridiculous. So to think that this is a new problem, answer, no, right? But we are at a point in time where we need to take some sort of definitive action, or we are going to continue to see serious problems with our rural health systems, particularly around ambulance services. So if you just look back at some of the things that have been done in the past, starting in 2002, Minnesota Department of Health identifies a quiet crisis around rural ambulance services at risk. 2002. 2015, Minnesota Ambulance Association partnered with Northwest Minnesota EMS region, held a summit. What came out of that was severe challenges around workforce and major problems around funding, particularly around Medicare, Medicaid reimbursements. 2016, Minnesota Department of Health, again, rural EMS sustainability survey, essentially said rural EMS, not sustainable. The only way that it's still operating today is because of subsidy from local governments, pancake fees, whatever you can come up with to generate money, but you're not making enough money on the street to keep these things sustainable. 2022, this is where it really started to get more and more attention, I think, is when the Office of Legislative Auditor weighs in on something, people start to pay attention. Legislators start to pay attention, legislative leadership starts to pay attention. There's some real credence in what the OLA says. And they basically said the entire system is broken, pointed a lot of fingers at the regulatory board, the EMSRB, and said you need to do something, legislature. Now, you can take all of that with a grain of salt, right? That's somebody's opinion, that's a group of somebody's opinions. What I generally like to turn to is what the Center for Rural Policy and Development will say. And they weighed in after the OLA report in 2022, and they listed all of these things that you can see on that slide there. These are the discrepancies. These are the problems. But in addition to that, at the very bottom, they said there's a need for a flexible approach. There is no one size fits all to the delivery of ambulance service in Minnesota. The metro is different from the suburbs. The suburbs are different from rural. We all understand that, we all get that. That's really why we actually exist. So Bradley talked a little bit about this. Why is the CGMC getting involved? And to be fair, we've not weighed into this issue area before, ever. One of the challenges for us is going to be that many of these decisions are going to be contained within the health insurance committees at the legislature. It's a space that no normal lobbyist wants to go to on a regular basis. But nonetheless, we're here, it's important to our members, and we're going to try to find some solutions. So there was a bill introduced last session, by Representative Becker Finn that really kind of started this whole ball rolling. And it was a significant change to the PSA law. Now, how many people in here are familiar with what the PSA law is? Nobody. Some of them, maybe. Who knows? Well, let's just make it this way. Marshall knows this thing inside and out. Let's just make it this way. In the mid-1980s, the state of Minnesota was divided up into about 265 primary service areas. If you had an ambulance company at that point in time and you were providing service to that particular area, that was solidified into law. You got that PSA, and essentially there was no way that anybody could ever take it away from you. It became very territorial. At the time, it was really about generating money or providing a service for your community. This bill that was introduced would have changed that whole PSA law and stood it on its head. It would have repealed all of the PSA that's been in existence since the mid-1980s and replaced it with municipal boundaries. So for the city of Red Wing, who has a current PSA, provides a service within their city and outside of their city, that PSA would have gone away and they would have been replaced with a PSA with a border right around their city. Now some may say, that's a good idea. Most places will say, that is a horrible idea. A, we're a city that may not want this PSA, but we're going to be forced to take it and we're going to have to contract that service out. B, we have an ambulance service, but we provide services outside of our city in order to generate enough money to make this thing work. This is where we started hearing all of the complaints. Why is that doing that? It's not even in my head. So we took a look at that. We actually testified against this bill in committee. The authors, the committee chair all said, look, this is probably not the solution to be fair, but we want to start a conversation. And they certainly have done that because we've been pretty deep in conversations with a number of folks ever since. So something needs to be done, and we feel that rural Minnesota cities need to be at the table, and that's why we're here. There is, and you're going to hear more talk about task forces and groups and people looking at this issue over the coming months. But essentially there was a EMS delivery and sustainability task force created. It's quote unquote unofficial, and I just want to briefly say why. There's two groups, Minnesota Ambulance Association and the Minnesota State Fire Chiefs Association, that really wanted to have the legislature create a task force to look at this issue, recognize this task force officially, and provide some funding for the task force to operate. That was during the 2023 session. The legislature did not take action on that, and the session closed without anything being done about it. So they took it upon themselves, and rightly so, to create a kind of an unofficial task force to continue to do that work and look at these issues. It's co-chaired by the MAA and the State Fire Chiefs Association. There are a number of stakeholders at the table that are listed there on the page, including the CGMC and the League. And I think I will say from my perspective that the group is making significant headway and should be expected to provide some good recommendations to the legislature in terms of finding solutions. I want to give a shout out to Marshall from Red Wing and Brian Holmer from Thief River Falls, who are kind of our representatives on this task force and have done a good job pointing out the needs and what's really important for rural Minnesota. So those are the folks that are involved in that particular task force. What have they done? So they've been meeting for a couple of months. They meet every 2 weeks. They've broken now into kind of subgroups or committees that looked at these 5 particular areas, right? And the one that we're probably most concerned with, at least on the front end, is funding. If I had to talk to every single PSA holder outside of the metro area and ask them to identify what is your number one concern, problem, issue. It is about lack of money, right? There is no business model out there where you can look at your expenditures versus your revenues, take a 40% return on your investment and say this is a good business model. It just does not pencil out in any world except for this one. It's unfortunate. So we have both Homer and Marshall on this funding group, and I think that we're going to see some good recommendations come out of there. We do anticipate this is going to take a while. There's going to be some short-term and acute solutions that we need to tackle in 2024, but the rest of it is going to take probably several years to get to a point where rural ambulance services and frankly statewide ambulance services are sustainable. I would like, I think hopefully this group would agree that this particular task force should be considered the subject matter experts on this particular issue. There is enough diversity in this group where I think we can accomplish that. There's no legislators in this group, so it's not political at all. This is a bunch of people that are really just caring about how we deliver health care to the public. It's plain as simple as that. So we hope that we can get to a point where they're recognized for that. So as we went on, we tried to figure out, where does the CGMC fit in this? Obviously, we've not taken this on before. We don't have a policy, right? So where do we fit in? What do we do? How do we get information out of our members? There was a work group established of CGMC members a couple months ago, maybe August or so. And you can see the cities that are represented there on the screen. This is who volunteered to participate. Notice went out to the membership. Anybody interested want to weigh in, participate in this work group. We got a ton of feedback, and it's been a great group. We have talked to and met with folks that we don't normally interact with on a daily basis. Not just elected officials or city administrators, but there's also just EMS directors and things like that in this work group as well. So, just to put some things into perspective, to give you some numbers to chew on here. Some key data points to think about. We talked about the number of PSAs in the state. There's about 256, give or take. Out of that 256, 140 of them are municipally owned. A lot of those are in the metro area, I will give you that. But we do have a number of our members in greater Minnesota that own their own PSA. 91 of the 256 are provider-owned, some sort of health care facility. We have private and nonprofit and private for-profit, and then there are 6 PSAs that are owned by the tribes. So that gives you a snapshot of the PSAs that we're talking about. Now this is kind of a key slide, which will lead into our discussion here in a little bit about what we do in 2024. We have pretty good data now. I say pretty good because nothing's ever perfect. But the only data that we have, and we think it's good, is from 2022. It applies to ground service ambulance only, so kind of take out the air component. We have a total reported costs statewide. This is all operational costs, right? Day-to-day operations, capital, volunteer subsidy, all of that factored in, about $577 million in 2022. That's what it costs to provide the service statewide. We know that for those services provided, about $1.2 billion was billed out to Medicare, Medicaid, insurance companies, private pay, whatever the case may be. That's about $1.2 billion. Now, if you could get a return on that $1.2 billion that was relatively high, this would be a lucrative business and everybody would want to do it. But we can't, and therein lies the problem. We know that total receivables out of the $1.2 billion is about $449 million. That's your 40% return. That leaves us a deficit of $127 million. Now, who's making that up? Local units of government are making that up, in most cases. That is where our problem is. We have a number of local units of government that have either said, we can't do it anymore, we're pulling out, and that PSA responsibility goes to somebody else. We have a number of local units of government that are right on the edge saying, we need to look at this really closely because we're subsidizing this thing to a tune of, $100, $200, $300, $500,000 a year, whatever the case may be, and it's becoming a problem. So that $127 million, we're going to come back to that later when we talk about our 2024 strategy. So we talked about the unofficial task force of subject matter experts that's been created that's doing pretty good work, I think. We talked about the working group of the CGMC that was created that did excellent work, I would say. And then a couple of weeks ago, late breaking news, the legislature creates their own task force because they are here to help. And I can say that because I know how this works. But we have a number of legislators that have some experience in this field, which is good. And they want to be a part of whatever the solution may be, and that's great. I think we should recognize that. I think we should appreciate that. But we need to make sure that the solutions that they come up with align with whatever our goals might be. So here you can see the members of the Legislative Task Force. This is a pretty good list, right? But for the two co-chairs, these are all Greater Minnesota legislators. And I think the lobbyists in the room could point out any one of these people that they've worked with in the past that have pretty good luck in terms of a track record on Greater Minnesota issues. But they intend probably to do some work. They probably intend to go around the state and have some listening sessions. They probably intend to introduce some legislation. And hopefully we get to a point where they can recognize the subject matter experts task force and take those recommendations back to the legislature with us. We'll see. That remains to be seen. But this is relatively new. We'll see what happens with that. So what are we going to do? And we'll talk about this more when we talk about our policies here shortly, but just to give you a sense of what's coming. We started off with our working group with the intent of bringing out information and trying to develop a set of principles that we could operate on going into session that would help guide us to create legislation. And again, remember, we're looking for solutions for rural Minnesota. So these are there's 5 of them, and we're going to be considering these a little bit later in the membership meeting. But just so you're aware, number 1 would be to support short-term funding from the state to these PSA license holders. Why are we doing that? Why are we having this conversation? It is because the federal government has not funded Medicare and Medicaid reimbursements the way that they should be for decades. And they refuse to do that because it's challenging, it's hard, there's no place for the money to come from, and they don't want to irritate seniors. All kinds of reasons there, but nonetheless, this is the cards that we're dealt with. So we have this shortfall, $127 million shortfall. So principle number 1 would be to support short-term funding from the state back to these license holders in order to kind of stop the bleeding, no pun intended. Approximately $130 million. We have data to support that. It makes some sense. If you think back to the list of all the people that hold those licenses, if it was 100% local units of government, this would be a really probably easy point to make with the legislature. But it's not. It's complicated because there's providers in the mix. There's for-profit. There's not-for-profit. We'll see how the conversation goes, but I think any one of our member cities that holds a PSA license that's providing a service would tell you the first thing and the number 1 thing that you could do would be give me some money without strings attached and let me keep operating. So that's our recommended principle number 1. We don't want this to be just a one-off, short-term, fix this for 2024 and then kind of forget about it again. We want to continue this work and we want to support medium range, kind of the next 2 to 5 years, state and federal funding mechanisms to support these licenses. That's going to be important. We are hopefully in a position where our state and our federal delegation can recognize the problems that we're facing and bring that back to Congress and say, look, we have to figure out a way to solve this problem. I don't know if that's possible, but nonetheless, we want to support that if it is. We want to make sure that any proposed changes to the EMSRB, so the EMSRB is the regulatory board that controls the ambulance license and the licensing of all the personnel that do that work, EMTs, paramedics, EMRs, etc. Any changes to that board should be done in a way to prevent further conflicts of interest going forward. And probably most important is that we have some government voices on that board. There are none today. Nobody in local government sits on that board. There's no voice there, even though we control, you control the majority of the PSA licenses in the state. So we think that if there are changes, and we're not saying we're going to rush right out and write this bill to do this, but if this falls into the conversation, we'd like to see some results come out that reflect local units of government on that board.
How many member boards there are on that
Oh,
board?
that's a very good question. I don't remember off the top of my head. It is several. Most of them are ambulance, Minnesota Association of Ambulance folks, or hospital providers. There's no local unit of government voice on that board, but I can get back to you with a number. Third principle is going to be to support long-term funding improvements to Medicare, Medicaid, and other relevant reimbursement services. If this had been done the whole time, we would not be having this conversation. Those of you that have the PSA in your city and are providing the services, this would be a good revenue source for your general fund budget. But we need to get to a point where somebody somewhere is actually funding the level of service that we're providing. Now, I started out saying that one of the things that kind of triggered this whole conversation was a bill that was dropped, introduced, heard in committee around changing the PSA law. We, being the working group, generally feels that the PSA law is not the problem that we need to be chasing right now. The problem that we need to be chasing revolves around funding, it revolves around workforce, retention, recruitment, but if there is an appetite for somebody, somewhere, to take on the PSA law, we want to weigh in on that, and we want to have some guiding principles behind that. One, and probably most important, is that there cannot be a one-size-fits-all approach. What works in one community somewhere may not work in another community somewhere else. And this was one of the key points from the Center for Rural Policy, was that we can't have a bill to change the entire PSA law that's been in place for nearly 40 years and just apply it statewide, because it's not going to work. We all know this. This is essentially why this organization exists, because there can't be a one-size-fits-all approach. Collaborations and consolidations needs to be on the table. Right? Nobody wants to talk about that because it's uncomfortable. It's something different. It's something new. It's something a lot of people don't even want to talk about. But it needs to be part of the conversation. If there are nearby communities that want to work together to create and collaborate together and create a system that works better for their communities, why would we not support that? There needs to be a framework that allows that to happen. Right now, there is none. We want to obviously include rural municipalities as a seat on the EMSRB. We talked about that. Ensure accountability and transparency for all licensed services. Now, folks in the room, not just this room, but other rooms, if I say this out loud, they say, what do you mean? I'm not being transparent right now? What are you talking about? When we talk about just data that comes out of all of this work that's done, we want to make sure that everybody is being treated equally and that all the information that we're getting is accurate, and we're getting enough information to make sure that decisions are made that make the best sense for the service provided. So it's not meant to be a threat, it's just meant to be a statement that everything that's done should be above board, it should be accountable, it should be transparent. It's pretty simple. One of the things that was pointed out by many folks that we talked to through our working group is that there's no consistent management model across the PSAs. Many cities have this in place already. They have a manager, that's in charge of the EMS director, whatever the case may be. They manage the entire PSA. They have a handle on it. It's good. It's great. We have a number of PSAs, especially in rural Minnesota, where we don't have a real effective management framework in place. So we think that there should be a consistent model built into the PSA law that would require a professional manager, that would require professional reporting, that would adhere to the accountability and transparency, and it would be equal across the board. It's a lot to ask in some cases, but nonetheless, it's very important for the service that's provided. And lastly, maybe the most controversial when we get back to the legislature would be to support this task force, this EMS and Sustainability Task Force, as the subject matter experts on providing recommendations. Now, that's going to be a tough pill for some legislators to swallow, but I think it's critically important. Too many times, and it's not just this area, but too many times we get into scenarios where legislators are making decisions based on politics. Big surprise. This is one area where that doesn't need to happen, and it shouldn't happen. This is an area where there should be bipartisan cooperation, and it shouldn't be based on who wins the next election. It shouldn't be based on how do I get the most votes. It should be based on EMS needs to be treated as part of public safety, needs to be funded, and we need to care about it. As Mayor Homer often says to me, if I call for an ambulance in Edina, I should get an ambulance come to my house. If I call for an ambulance in Ely, I should get an ambulance come to my house. If I call for an ambulance in Nashwauk, I should get an ambulance come to my house. There's going to be different response times, and there's going to be different types of service. But nonetheless, it is something that we should anticipate, and we should expect, and we should appreciate statewide. So we think this subject matter expert group is the group to do that. And hopefully we can get to a point where they're actually recognized by the legislature. We're going to talk a little bit more when we get into the membership meeting about what we would like to do in 2024. But that gives you a sense of where we're going. It's a super complicated issue, but it needs to be solved. And I think there are enough groups looking at this now with a serious intent to find solutions that we can actually make some progress. Going to the state legislature and asking for something north of $100 million is a huge ask. It's a huge lift. But nonetheless, if you think about the issue that we're trying to solve, it's pretty critical, right? The state of Minnesota has had a history of treating the ambulance service as more of a transportation arm than it has treating it as part of public safety. And if we treat it as public safety and we honor it as public safety, we think we can get to a position where we can start to solve this problem. So, any questions? Other than how many people are on the EMSRP? Oh, I think it's 20. I think it's 20 people on the EMSRP. Phone a friend.
Maybe, and I'm going to put her a little bit on the spot, but we do have Ann Finn from the league here. And I don't know, Ann, you've been very involved in this particular effort on behalf of the league. Is there anything you want to say from the league's perspective in terms of kind of where things stand or where you think things might be going?
Thanks, Bradley. Well, Erik's presentation was fantastic. You really captured everything that I would have offered here, but the league is also very engaged in this. Our board of directors adopted our policy platform last week, and EMS has been identified as one of 12 priorities. The working group that Erik was talking about, the task force, is actually convening in the league building, and we are providing a streaming option. So if anyone here wants to listen in on those task force meetings, we're happy to get you dialed in and you can listen. And we are very determined to give you some recommendations that address problems statewide. I do agree that the bill that came forward last year was skewed largely toward the metro, and part of the reason for that is the Fire Chiefs Association was very dialed in on that issue and disproportionately was representing some positions that I think were metro-centric. We have become aware that there are different issues all over the state based on where you live and what service model is being used. So being able to dial in on that, I think will help us reach some recommendations that really get at solutions that help everybody. So thanks for the moment.
Absolutely, and I just want to note, I think this is actually a good example of the ways in which our work and the League's work are complementary, right? And the League has been convening this group, helping bring people together, staffing it, providing resources, and we have been able to convene some of our members to look at it and interact with that working group from a greater Minnesota perspective in terms of bringing to the table what are the particular unique issues, concerns that our members have, and plug into the process that they've created, and then hopefully in February be marching arm in arm, not only with the League but other stakeholders on some recommendations going forward. So I think it's a great partnership, and it is, I think, exemplary of the kind of interaction and ways in which our work and the League's work are complementary. Any questions? We do have a couple of minutes. You want to?
My colleague here just suggested that I tell a little bit about our story in Nashwauk. Nashwauk is a small community of roughly right under 1,000 people. We have run our own ambulance service for umpteen years. I think it's been like 30, 35 years. And then it was turned over to the city bought it to kind of keep it going. Back 10 years ago, to 10 to 15 years, our city was showing at the end of the year anywhere from $500,000 to $650,000 profit on the ambulance service. With the trend and things that have changed over the last few years, the last 7 consecutive years now, we have had significant losses where last year our loss was $225,000. This year we just completed it. Looks like our total loss for the year is going to be $120,000. Our problem is that we have a large service area, but the city itself, only the city taxpayers are paying for the ambulance service. Our city residents use only about 36% of the ambulance calls. The rest of them are out in the other 4 communities, plus 4 townships that are there. They pay nothing for the ambulance service, but have the same use we do. We've been unable to get them to share in that cost because even providing a taxing district, they're not obligated to provide that money into the city coffers for ambulance service. They can do what they want with it. So we've struggled. We haven't been able to find a good solution to that. And we've gotten to the point where we can't, it's not only not sustainable, we're there now. So we are in the process of at least looking at our options, and we're calling for proposals from other entities, such as the major healthcare providers, to see if anyone would be interested in that service, just to see where we might go. I've talked several times with Eric, and we watch very closely, and make calls to these 2 committees that are working, but our community is no different than many of yours. We need help on this to keep that ambulance service available. The last thing I want to do is be in office and lose that ambulance service to our community. So it just shows one example of a city where it's critical. It's not a problem, it's critical.
Thank you, Mayor. I appreciate that, and I think it's emblematic of the stories that we've been hearing, that Eric's been hearing, not only through the working group, but he's also been traveling around the state, meeting with cities on an individual basis. Anything else you want to say, Eric, before we wrap up?
Yeah, I do want to just speak briefly to the mayor's comments here, because I think it's relevant. Some cities, councils, mayors, administrations that are facing similar dilemmas will have to ask this question. Do we give up this PSA? Do we turn it over to a provider? Do we sell it to somebody? Do we contract out? This is the thing that we're trying to get in front of, because we've seen this happen in other places. If you give up that PSA or turn it over to a provider or somebody else to provide that service, granted, ambulances are still going to show up. What you have no control over is how quickly they show up, what kind of service they have, or who the folks are that are on that ambulance. So it's kind of a local control question. So just be aware of that. all we really want to do, I think, in terms of finding a solution is figure out a way to make this sustainable going forward so that you don't have to face questions like this. Should we or should we not?
Yeah, Craig.
I don't know the specifics of it and hearing the comments there, but why isn't enacting a compulsory taxing district an option?
You want to repeat the question?
So the question was, why isn't enacting a compulsory taxing district an option? I think all options are on the table, right? I think that is a fair thing to bring up. I think there are other ideas that are out there. I think that this group that's working, our internal group that's been working, would say that that is a big thing to try to talk about in a couple of months' time and enact in the 2024 session. I think going into the 2025 session, when we're going into a new budget year, I think we're going to have a long list of recommendations perhaps to try to resolve this problem. That may or may not be one of them. But I think a long-term sustainable revenue solution to backfill where the federal government has failed us is going to be necessary. But going into 2024, we need an immediate influx of cash to get out to these folks so that they're not faced with decisions like that. But that is absolutely going to be on the table, I'm pretty sure.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, you know, as Erik said and as Ann said, this is gonna be a long-term effort. We've got you know, step one, what do we do immediately, and then continue to keep the brains at the table and use whatever momentum we get on the first part to propel us forward.